The exact moment when a dismissive avoidant decides to reach out occurs when their carefully constructed emotional fortress experiences a sudden, catastrophic internal collapse that can no longer be repaired through their usual defensive mechanisms. Their nervous system, which has operated for years on the assumption that emotional walls provide safety and protection, suddenly recognizes that these barriers have become a prison that is suffocating their capacity for authentic human connection. This collapse is not gradual or predictable, but represents a psychological emergency where their defensive architecture fails all at once, leaving them feeling exposed, vulnerable, and desperate for the very connection they have spent years avoiding. Their mind, accustomed to rationalizing away emotional needs and maintaining the illusion of self-sufficiency, suddenly cannot generate convincing arguments for continued isolation when faced with the stark reality of their emptiness. The physiological manifestations of this fortress collapse include intense panic responses, as their nervous system realizes that their primary coping mechanism has stopped functioning. Their body experiences symptoms similar to withdrawal from an addictive substance, as they are suddenly cut off from the false sense of safety that emotional detachment provided. Heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, and overwhelming anxiety flood their system as they confront their fundamental vulnerability. Their cognitive processes become overwhelmed by the simultaneous recognition of their deep loneliness and their desperate need for the specific person they have pushed away. The avoidance mind, usually skilled at compartmentalization and emotional suppression, finds itself flooded with memories, feelings, and longings that can no longer be contained or controlled through their typical mental strategies. The psychological weight of this collapse manifests as an existential crisis, where they question everything they believed about relationships, independence, and emotional safety. Their entire identity structure, built around the premise that they don't need others and that connection is dangerous, crumbles under the weight of their accumulated loneliness and the recognition that their isolation has become unbearable. Their emotional regulation system, calibrated for decades to maintain distance and control, becomes completely dysregulated as they experience feelings of intensity that they have no framework for managing. The avoidant discovers that their usual techniques for emotional suppression are powerless against the overwhelming flood of need, regret, and longing that accompanies their fortress collapse. The timing of this collapse often coincides with external stresses or life events that strip away their ability to maintain their defensive posture. Illness, loss, major life changes, or simply the accumulation of years of emotional starvation can trigger the sudden recognition that their walls are not protecting them but are actually destroying their capacity for meaningful human connection. Their nervous system experiences this collapse as a life-threatening emergency, triggering intense stress responses and fight or flight activation that creates urgency around reconnection. The avoidant feels as though they are drowning in their own isolation, and that reaching out represents their only chance for psychological survival and emotional oxygen. The internal collapse creates a window of opportunity where their usual defensive calculations and risk assessments become temporarily disabled by the intensity of their psychological crisis. During this crucial period, their desperate need for connection overrides their fear of vulnerability, rejection, and emotional exposure that normally prevents them from reaching out. Their sleep becomes severely disrupted as their subconscious mind processes the magnitude of their psychological crisis and the recognition that their entire approach to relationships may have been fundamentally flawed. Dreams become populated with scenarios of connection and reconciliation that feel more real and meaningful than their waking, isolated existence. The fortress collapse forces them to confront the possibility that their defensive strategies have not only failed to protect them, but have actively worked against their deepest needs for love, understanding, and authentic human connection. This recognition creates waves of grief and self-recrimination that threaten to overwhelm their already fragile emotional regulation systems. Their mind begins generating catastrophic scenarios about what will happen if they continue on their current path of isolation, leading to recognition that the risks of continued emotional withdrawal may actually be greater than the risks of vulnerable reconnection. This shift in risk assessment becomes crucial in their decision to overcome their defensive patterns and reach out. The moment their body betrays their mind. The exact moment of reaching out often occurs when the avoidant's physical body begins generating symptoms and responses that cannot be ignored, suppressed, or rationalized away by their cognitive defenses. Their nervous system, pushed beyond its capacity to maintain emotional detachment, begins producing physiological distress signals that force them to acknowledge the true cost of their isolation on their overall health and well-being. Their cardiovascular system may begin showing signs of chronic stress through irregular heart rhythms, chest pain, or blood pressure changes that cannot be attributed to physical health issues alone. The avoidance body begins communicating through physical symptoms what their mind has been unwilling to acknowledge, that their emotional isolation is literally killing them from the inside out. The psychological impact of recognizing that their emotional patterns are manifesting as physical illness creates a crisis that penetrates their usual ability to intellectualize and dismiss their emotional needs. Their mind, skilled at rationalizing away psychological pain, struggles to explain away tangible physical symptoms that clearly correlate with their emotional state and relationship patterns. Their digestive system often becomes severely compromised as chronic stress and emotional suppression take their toll on their physical functioning. The avoidant may experience persistent digestive problems, loss of appetite, or other gastrointestinal symptoms that force them to confront the connection between their emotional isolation and their physical health. The sleep disruption that accompanies their emotional crisis begins affecting their cognitive functioning, work performance, and daily life in ways that cannot be ignored or managed through willpower alone. Their body's need for rest becomes impossible to satisfy, while their mind remains tormented by regret, longing, and the recognition of their profound loneliness. Their immune system, weakened by chronic stress and emotional isolation, may fail them repeatedly through frequent illnesses, slow healing, or other signs that their body is breaking down under the weight of their defensive patterns. The avoidant realizes that their attempt to protect themselves emotionally has compromised their physical resilience and overall health. The moment of recognition often occurs when they understand that their body is providing undeniable evidence of what their mind has been trying to suppress, that they are not designed for the level of isolation they have imposed upon themselves. Their nervous system's distress signals become impossible to ignore or rationalize away through their usual cognitive strategies. Their breathing patterns may become chronically shallow or disrupted as their nervous system struggles with the constant stress of maintaining emotional walls while simultaneously craving the connection they have denied themselves. This physiological symptom often becomes the trigger that forces them to recognize the unsustainable nature of their current emotional state. The physical manifestation of their emotional crisis creates urgency that overrides their usual careful deliberation and defensive calculations. When their body begins failing them in obvious and concerning ways, the avoidant realizes that their psychological strategies are not just emotionally costly, but potentially life-threatening to their physical health. Their nervous system's rebellion against continued isolation manifests as anxiety disorders, panic attacks, or depression that can no longer be managed through their typical coping mechanisms of emotional suppression and rational analysis. The intensity of their physical symptoms forces them to acknowledge that professional help or significant life changes are necessary for their survival. The recognition that their emotional patterns are destroying their physical health creates a shift in their cost-benefit analysis of reaching out versus remaining isolated. When continued isolation threatens their physical survival and well-being, the risks of vulnerability and potential rejection begin to seem manageable by comparison. Their body's betrayal of their mind's defensive strategies forces them to confront the reality that they cannot continue on their current path without serious consequences to their overall health and longevity. This recognition often provides the final push they need to overcome their defensive patterns and risk reaching out for the connection they desperately need. The recognition of irreversible time loss. The pivotal moment when an avoidant decides to reach out often coincides with a sudden, overwhelming awareness of time's finite nature and the recognition that they may be running out of opportunities to repair or rebuild the connections they have destroyed through their defensive patterns. Their nervous system, confronted with the reality of aging, mortality, or missed opportunities, experiences panic responses that override their usual defensive calculations. Their psychological framework previously focused on infinite time and endless opportunities for connection, suddenly shifts to scarcity thinking as they realize that the people they care about may not always be available or willing to reconnect. This temporal awareness creates urgency that penetrates their usual ability to delay, avoid, or postpone difficult emotional decisions. The cognitive impact of recognizing time loss manifests as obsessive mental calculations about how much time has already been wasted in isolation and how much time remains to create meaningful connections. Their mind becomes dominated by regret about lost years and anxiety about whether they still have opportunities to repair the damage their avoidant patterns have caused. Their emotional regulation system becomes overwhelmed by waves of grief as they process the full magnitude of what their defensive strategies have cost them over time. The avoidant realizes that their attempt to protect themselves from potential hurt has guaranteed actual loss through the passage of time and missed opportunities for love and connection. The physiological stress of confronting irreversible time loss manifests as intense anxiety, panic attacks, and sleep disruption as their nervous system processes the reality that some opportunities may be gone forever. Their body responds to this recognition with emergency-level stress responses that create urgency around immediate action and reconnection. Their relationship with mortality becomes a central concern, as they recognize that both they and the people they care about are aging, and that death will eventually make reconnection impossible. This existential awareness strips away their ability to maintain the illusion that they have unlimited time to address their relationship needs and emotional isolation. The psychological pressure of time scarcity creates a window where their fear of continued isolation becomes greater than their fear of vulnerability and rejection. The avoidant realizes that the guaranteed loss of continued isolation is worse than the potential loss that comes with risking reconnection and emotional exposure. Their cognitive processes begin focusing obsessively on specific memories and moments when they could have chosen differently, creating mental scenarios where they calculate the cumulative cost of their avoidant patterns over months and years. This rumination becomes so intense that it overrides their ability to maintain their usual emotional detachment. The recognition of time loss often triggers what psychologists call mortality salience, an awareness of death that forces people to confront what truly matters to them. For the avoidant, this awareness strips away their defensive rationalizations and forces them to acknowledge their fundamental need for human connection and love. Their nervous system experiences the recognition of time loss as a form of bereavement as they grieve not just for specific lost relationships, but for their entire pattern of choosing isolation over connection. This grief becomes so overwhelming that reaching out feels like their only option for psychological survival and healing. The temporal pressure creates a now or never mentality that overrides their usual careful deliberation and risk assessment. The avoidant realizes that continued delay and avoidance may result in permanent loss of opportunities that they cannot afford to lose, creating urgency that compels immediate action. Their understanding of time's irreversible nature forces them to confront the possibility that they may have already waited too long to repair some relationships, creating desperation that overcomes their typical fear of rejection. The potential regret of not trying becomes more frightening than the potential pain of trying and failing. The collapse of their rationalization system. The exact moment an avoidant decides to reach out occurs when their sophisticated system of rationalization and self-justification experiences complete breakdown, leaving them unable to generate convincing arguments for continued isolation. Their mind, typically skilled at creating elaborate justifications for emotional avoidance, suddenly finds itself incapable of maintaining the cognitive frameworks that have supported their defensive patterns. Their nervous system experiences this rationalization collapse as a form of psychological emergency, as the mental structures they have relied upon for emotional regulation and decision-making suddenly become unavailable. Without their usual ability to intellectualize away their emotional needs, they are left facing the raw reality of their loneliness and desperate need for connection. The psychological foundation of their avoidant patterns has always depended on their ability to convince themselves that isolation is preferable to the risks of vulnerability and potential hurt. When this cognitive ability fails them, they are left without their primary tool for managing their fundamental attachment needs and fears about emotional exposure. Their internal dialogue, usually dominated by logical arguments against emotional risk-taking and vulnerability, becomes flooded with contradictory evidence that they can no longer dismiss or rationalize away. The avoidant finds themselves unable to maintain their usual mental frameworks when confronted with overwhelming evidence of their own suffering and need. The cognitive dissonance between their lived experience of isolation and their intellectual justifications for this isolation becomes so intense that their mind can no longer maintain both simultaneously. The avoidant must choose between continuing to believe their rationalizations or acknowledging the reality of their emotional starvation and desperate need for reconnection. Their emotional regulation system, dependent on cognitive justifications for maintaining distance and control, becomes completely dysregulated when these mental supports are no longer available. Without their ability to rationalize their behavior, they are forced to confront their authentic feelings and needs without intellectual buffers or protective explanations. The breakdown of their rationalization system often occurs when external evidence directly contradicts their internal narratives about relationships, independence, and emotional safety. The avoidant may witness examples of healthy relationships, experience unexpected kindness, or encounter information that challenges their fundamental assumptions about human connection. Their nervous system experiences intense anxiety and panic as their primary psychological defense mechanism becomes unavailable when they need it most. The collapse of their rationalization system leaves them feeling psychologically naked and defenseless against their own emotional needs and the reality of their profound isolation. The mental exhaustion of maintaining elaborate justifications for behaviors that are clearly causing them suffering becomes unsustainable when their cognitive resources are depleted by stress, illness, or other life challenges. The avoidant discovers that they no longer have the mental energy required to maintain their complex system of emotional self-deception. Their ability to generate alternative explanations for their behavior and feelings becomes compromised when they are forced to confront undeniable evidence of their own emotional needs and the cause of their avoidant patterns. The rationalization system that once felt impenetrable suddenly seems transparent and unconvincing even to themselves. The psychological pressure of living with constant cognitive dissonance between their rationalizations and their lived experience becomes unbearable when their mental defenses are compromised. The avoidant realizes that they can no longer sustain the psychological effort required to maintain beliefs that contradict their direct emotional experience. Their recognition that their rationalization system has been serving as a prison rather than protection creates waves of grief and self-recrimination that further compromise their ability to maintain their defensive mental frameworks. This creates a cascade effect where the failure of one rationalization leads to the questioning of their entire system of emotional self-protection, the moment of existential terror about dying alone. The decisive moment when a dismissive avoidant chooses to reach out often arrives as a sudden, overwhelming wave of existential terror about the possibility of dying completely alone and unknown. Their nervous system, confronted with the stark reality of human mortality and their own profound isolation, experiences panic responses that completely override their usual defensive mechanisms and fear of vulnerability. This existential terror manifests not as a gradual realization, but as a sudden psychological emergency that floods their system with the recognition that their current path leads to a death characterized by complete loneliness and disconnection from authentic human love. Their mind, usually skilled at avoiding such thoughts, becomes unable to suppress this terrifying awareness of their ultimate destination. The physiological impact of this existential terror includes intense panic responses, difficulty breathing, and overwhelming anxiety as their nervous system processes the full implications of continued isolation. Their body responds to this recognition as it would to an immediate physical threat, flooding their system with stress hormones and emergency-level activation that demands immediate action. Their psychological framework undergoes complete reconstruction as they confront the reality that their defensive strategies, designed to protect them from emotional pain, have created a life trajectory that ends in the very abandonment and isolation they most fear. This recognition strips away their ability to maintain their usual mental justifications for continued emotional withdrawal. The terror is often triggered by witnessing death, illness, or aging in others, forcing them to confront their own mortality, and the recognition that time is finite for creating meaningful human connections. Their nervous system cannot tolerate the awareness that they may die without ever experiencing genuine love, understanding, or authentic intimacy with another human being. Their cognitive processes become dominated by vivid mental images of their own death, surrounded by emptiness, with no one to mourn their passing or remember their existence with love and affection. These death scenarios feel more real and immediate than their current daily existence, creating psychological urgency that overrides their usual defensive calculations. The existential terror extends beyond fear of physical death to encompass fear of psychological and emotional death, the recognition that they may live their entire lives without ever being truly known, understood, or loved by another person. This form of existential death feels even more frightening than physical mortality, because it represents a life completely devoid of meaning and connection. Their nervous system experiences this terror as a survival emergency that requires immediate action to prevent the ultimate tragedy of a wasted life. The intensity of their fear about dying alone becomes so overwhelming that the risks associated with vulnerability and emotional exposure pale in comparison to the guaranteed tragedy of continued isolation. The psychological impact includes recognition that their defensive patterns have not protected them from their deepest fears, but have actually guaranteed their realization. The avoidant understands that their attempts to avoid emotional pain have created the very outcome they most desperately wanted to prevent: complete abandonment and isolation. Their emotional regulation system becomes completely overwhelmed by the intensity of existential terror, making their usual coping mechanisms of suppression and rationalization completely ineffective. The magnitude of their fear forces them to acknowledge that dramatic action is required to change their life trajectory before it becomes too late for meaningful connection. The terror often includes recognition that they may have already damaged their chances for reconnection beyond repair, creating desperate urgency around immediate action before more opportunities are lost forever. This temporal pressure, combined with existential fear, creates a psychological state where reaching out becomes their only option for preventing their worst nightmare. Their understanding of legacy and meaning becomes central to their terror, as they realize they may leave no positive impact on other people's lives and may be forgotten immediately after their death. This recognition of existential meaninglessness becomes unbearable for someone who has spent their life believing that independence and self-sufficiency were sources of strength and purpose, the final surrender to their desperate need. The ultimate moment when a dismissive avoidant decides to reach out represents a complete psychological surrender to their fundamental human need for connection that they have spent years denying, suppressing, and fighting against. Their nervous system, exhausted from decades of maintaining emotional walls and defensive barriers, finally acknowledges that continued resistance to their attachment needs is not just futile, but is actively destroying their capacity for happiness and fulfillment. This surrender is not a gradual process, but represents a sudden collapse of their entire defensive identity structure, as they recognize that their attempts to be completely self-sufficient have failed catastrophically. Their mind, previously skilled at maintaining the illusion of independence, becomes overwhelmed by the undeniable evidence of their desperate hunger for love, understanding, and authentic human connection. The physiological manifestations of this surrender include profound exhaustion, as their nervous system stops expending energy on maintaining emotional barriers that have proven ineffective at providing genuine safety or satisfaction. Their body experiences relief mixed with terror, as they stop fighting against their own fundamental nature and attachment needs. Their psychological framework undergoes complete reconstruction as they acknowledge that their entire approach to relationships and emotional safety has been based on false assumptions about human nature and their own needs. The avoidant realizes that their defensive strategies have not made them stronger, but have actually made them more vulnerable to the very abandonment and isolation they feared most. The cognitive shift involves recognizing that their need for connection is not a weakness to be overcome, but a fundamental aspect of their humanity that deserves acknowledgement and fulfillment. Their mind, previously focused on suppressing these needs, suddenly becomes focused on strategies for meeting them, even if this requires unprecedented levels of vulnerability and risk. Their emotional regulation system, no longer required to suppress and deny their attachment needs, begins operating from a foundation of self-acceptance rather than self-rejection. This internal shift creates space for authentic feelings and needs to surface without the usual internal resistance and self-criticism that has characterized their emotional experience. The surrender process involves grieving the years they have spent fighting against their own nature and recognizing that their suffering has been largely self-imposed through their refusal to acknowledge their fundamental need for human connection. This grief becomes a catalyst for action, as they realize they cannot afford to waste any more time in self-imposed emotional exile. Their nervous system experiences this surrender as both relief and terror, as they stop expending enormous amounts of energy on maintaining defenses while simultaneously recognizing their vulnerability without these familiar protective mechanisms. The psychological nakedness of surrender feels both liberating and terrifying as they prepare to risk authentic connection. The moment of surrender often includes recognition that their need for the specific person they are considering reaching out to has become so intense that continued suppression is causing more suffering than the potential risks of rejection or hurt. Their desperation overcomes their defensive programming as they acknowledge that some connections are worth any risk. Their understanding of strength and vulnerability undergoes complete transformation, as they realize that acknowledging their needs and reaching out requires more courage than continued isolation and emotional numbness. The avoidant discovers that true strength involves embracing their humanity rather than denying it through defensive withdrawal. The final surrender involves accepting that they would rather risk devastating rejection while being authentic than continue living with the guaranteed suffering of emotional isolation and self-imposed loneliness. This shift in their risk tolerance represents fundamental change in their psychological priorities and values. Their recognition that surrender to their needs is actually surrender to their authentic self creates the foundation for reaching out from a place of self-acceptance rather than desperation. This internal shift makes their eventual communication more likely to be successful because it comes from acknowledgement of their worth rather than from self-rejection and emotional starvation. The moment of surrender ultimately represents their decision to choose hope over fear, connection over safety, and authentic living over defensive existence. This choice, once made, creates unstoppable momentum toward reaching out because they have finally aligned their actions with their deepest needs and authentic nature rather than fighting against themselves.